Okay, so now, with your permission, we are recording this session. And what we are doing is we are trying to have an idea of the historic significance of the 20th century and how the events of the 19th century have bled into the 20th century and led to a very important process in history making. Okay, so as I was telling you, Britain was one of the greatest empires that was established in modern times. And there was this concept that the sun never set on the English empire precisely because there were so many colonies and in so many parts of the world that it was always daytime in one or more of them. Understand? So it is from this point of view that we should be looking at the history of Britain, basically. Okay, as an empire that began somewhere around, concertedly from the Elizabethan times, and then went on, expanded, and established itself during the Victorian era, and how this decline came about or the breakup happened by the time it was the 20th century. Understand? So this historical charting is something that you are extremely familiar with. The wars with countries like Spain and the breaking up of the Spanish Armada, and how a strong force of British nationalism could be seen in the place and the other place surrounding the Elizabethan age, and how there was this skepticism that came down during the Victorian era, and then you have the modernism, which is a very, very defining, let's say, thought process in the 20th century. And modernism is another thing, but modernity, which is the way that one grapples with one's cultural experiences and the cultural realities of the world outside of us. That is what we call modernity. The way that various parts of the world have negotiated this, keeping in mind their colonial pasts as well. That is another important aspect which has come to influence British literature and the literatures written in English from other parts of the world over the ages. Understand? How is it that modernity has been negotiated with? Okay, so you should understand that it is very, very interesting to observe the ways that world views of British writers have changed over the years, and how it is that they have viewed the social, political, historical, as well as cultural processes that have evolved around them, not just in other parts of their colony, but also in other parts of the continent of Europe itself. Okay, so some of the basic, let's say, landmark events that happened in the 20th century. Of course, you have the two world wars, the Nazi Holocaust. Okay, then the breakup of the Soviet Union, the establishment and the breakup of the Soviet Union, the kind of, let's say, tortures that were perpetrated on the people during the Stalinist era. Okay, the mass hunger and starvation of millions of people across Asia and Africa. The excuse me. Yeah, the mass starvation that I was talking about. Then, of course, the nuclear armament and the way that the Second World War came to an end, in the last century. Okay, just give me a minute, please. Yeah. Okay. Then, of course, the 20th century, we can say, is a rather pivotal time because it takes us from the skepticism of the Victorian era, and it is, let's say, a kind of a cusp kind of a time, because people have been looking back, and then they've also been trying to detach themselves from the effects of the past, but at the same time they are so deeply entrenched in their present that their world views, their cultural views, all of these things are, I would say, symptomatic of the age that they live in. While that is true about almost all ages, in the 20th century, there was something very peculiar about the 20th century, because it was a time, where I would say that the Eurocentric vision began to fail. Okay, it began to falter. That conviction that Europe had in its cultural, moral, ethical superiority began to flounder. Okay, that vision began to falter because they realized that they are just as bloodthirsty, they are just as savage as they imagined the rest of the world to be. Understand? So there was no such thing as if they had been given this God-given moral right to rule over the millions of people that they had been ruling over all these centuries. Understand? This particular time represented a break. The war had finally come home. See, we should understand that Europe hadn't fought a war for a long time, but here they were, with the Spanish Civil War itself, they were fighting these wars between each other, and then the ultimate war that came about in the First World War. Okay, and they thought that would be the end of it all, but then that kind of bled into the Second World War, and this devastation was just too much to take. Understand? The impact that it made, the social effect that it produced, it was way too much to understand and absorb. Okay, so all around them, their monuments of ideologies were crumbling. Understand? Their monuments of ideologies were crumbling, their colonies were crumbling, their economic might was crumbling. Across the ocean there was another power that was rising in the form of America. Understand? And here they also had to deal with the guilt of having reduced a nation to rubble. I mean Japan. Understand? And right in the heart of Europe was some of the most horrendous concentration camps that had come up. Understand? People who were emerging alive from there looked like skeletons with life in them. Okay. And all this while, there was also this guilt that they just stood around doing nothing, allowed all of this to develop, and then had to jump in as a corrective action. Okay. So, the way that they viewed life, the way that they viewed art, all of these things was extremely polarized. It was, I think, colored by the view of the world that they had around them at that point of time. There were sociological troubles as well, there was domestic trouble as well, because during the First World War the women had been engaged to do work in the office while the men went out to fight. We had discussed this, I think, in the first semester, right? And then when the men came back, they had no work. So the women were asked to again go back to their domestic work while the men were managing everything. Understand? In the offices. But there was also this problem of post traumatic stress disorder that had not been dealt with at that point of time. Understand? And then came about the Second World War, where again the men had to go out to fight and the women were asked to manage the offices. But this time they went one further. There were doctors among women, there were nurses among women, there were more qualified personnel among women who took active part in the war. Is somebody's mic on? Shireen's mic is on. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, who took active part in the war. Understand? So so this kind of brought about this greater demand for gender equality that gave women a voice, a presence, and political, let's say, power. Okay, so all of these things were very, very crucial in determining the cultural, gendered, political, economic aspects of not just England, but all of Europe for the times to come. Understand? So, those odd, unspoken of barriers between the various, let's say, societies began to crumble. Understand? Yes, and as far as Britain is concerned, the 20th century was a time of declining national fortune. Okay, declining national power and fortune, because they had these two wars to fight, and there was a lot of destruction of property. There was this need for rebuilding, and Britain had to give up a lot of its colonies, lot of its investments. It had to sell a lot of national wealth in order to find the money for covering all these damages. Okay, and it had to liberate colonies like India, Pakistan, Burma, Nigeria, Rhodesia, Kenya, and so it was no longer that voice in world politics that it used to be. Understand? Yes. So I'm not saying that Britain was completely crumbled or something of that sort. No, but they were not who they used to be. Whereas on the other side of the Atlantic, you had America, who had come up, from being a former colony. It had its factories, it had its land, it had its economic power. It was, becoming the world leader. The Second World War literally showed the emergence of American military as well as diplomatic power. Okay, so as I was telling you, the women, okay, in the 20th century, the early 20th century in Britain, began to agitate for their rights. Okay, and also you had the Irish who were agitating for their freedom. Understand? So you had this momentous occasion called the Easter Uprising of 1916, 1916, and finally in 1921 the Irish Free State was created, in 1921. Okay, and in the 1950s, because and communism became a huge, let's say, a presence in the European as well as in America, European countries as well as in America. So in the 1950s, the first Labour Party came into power in the 1950 actually, and this was supposed to be a great achievement for the Labour Party, because the Labour Party, there are two parties in England. One is the Conservatives and the other is the Labour Party. Okay, so for the Labour Party to come into power, it was a victory of the common man. So the people felt that now their concerns are going to be addressed. See, I don't know if you know about the Second World War, where there was mass hunger and starvation and famine, particularly in countries like Germany, where the people were going so hungry that they had to form these long lines for bread and so on. And this was why the idea of establishing a pure German state for Germans appealed to the German people. Did you know about that? Okay, I don't know whether you know about that. Ah, yes, good. Yeah, you know about that. Yeah. So, we realized that there were these sociological conditions that had come about. Okay, so the coming of the Labour government, elected Labour government in 1950, was a huge sign, a positive sign for the common people, who felt that finally the working class will get their concerns addressed. Okay, that people will listen to them, that their government is there for them. But unfortunately, the Labour Party was unable to fulfill the promises that it made to its people, leading to a sense of widespread disillusionment. Okay, and at this point, I would like to mention this landmark play by John Osborne called Look Back in Anger. Have you heard of Look Back in Anger?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Have you heard of The Angry Young Man? Are you angry, young girls? No, you are very quiet, young girls. Okay, so see, have you heard of Amitabh Bachchan?
Yes, ma'am.
Amitabh Bachchan.
Yes, ma'am.
Ah, okay. Amitabh Bachchan is supposed to be the original angry young man. Do you know that? Maybe your parents will be able to tell you more about that. See, in the 1980s and so on, 70s, 80s and so on, in India, we got independence in 1947. Then the first initial decade, that is 1947 to the 1950s, maximum 1960s, we spent in a lot of optimism. Okay, we were nation building, we were doing 5-year plans, Panchashil Paddhati, that is what is called the 5-year plans, building dams, creating nation, and that sense of optimism was there. Okay, even the songs of the time were like, Saathi Haath Badana, Ek Akela Thak Jayega, Milkar Boj Uthana, that is, friend, stretch out your hand, one person doing all the work will be tired, so let us get together and do all this work and so on. അങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ ഒരു nice feel good feeling ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. By the time the 1960s came about, and then we had this war with a neighboring country, it led to a great deal of disillusionment for India and Indians, because we had called them our brothers. Okay, there was always this Hindi and them bhai bhai kind of a thing. But then they crossed the border in the middle of the night and created the first the Indo China war, And what happened was that, it led to a great deal of disillusionment among the Indians. And then on, there was this change in national temperament. There was a greater deal of suspicion that was there in the way that we negotiated and carried out diplomacies, because at that point of time, India was at the forefront of the NAM movement. The NAM, what is the NAM? കോളേജിൽ പഠിച്ചില്ലെങ്കിലും സ്കൂളിലെങ്കിലും പഠിച്ചു കാണത്തില്ലേ? NAM, what is the NAM that India was at the forefront of and captured the
Non-alignment
imagination?
movement.
Non-alignment movement.
Finally, thank you. Yes, the non-alignment movement. Okay. So we were at the forefront of that. We were establishing a parallel diplomacy, because at that point of time, all countries had to be aligned either to the US or to the USSR. Okay, but here was India, who was a friend of the USSR, but wanted to also establish a legacy of its own. Okay, so the NAM. So we were doing quite well in our own fashion, in our own way, and so on, till the Indochina War happened, and then that kind of led to a temperament. Change in the way that Indian diplomatic relationships were carried out, and additional to that, the it was felt that the promise that was made to the people during the initial years of the independence could not be fulfilled, that we were hitting these snags of development. Understand? And there was a great deal of corruption that was arising on account of the licensing Raj. Okay, that is, everything that you had to make in India, you needed a license for. If you needed to import some machinery or goods or anything of that sort for construction purposes and so on, you had to again apply for licenses. And to give you these licenses, officials would charge huge amounts of money in the form of bribes, okay, in the form for corruption. In that kind of a thing was there. So this licensing Raj was making life very difficult for people. There was mass unemployment. The youth of the country were getting angry. You had this reflected in the movies of the time, like you had Palas Nilhani's movies. You had movies like Ankush and so on, which showed how angry the youth were, how unemployed they were, and it showed a very disturbing social scenario. Now, born out of this social scenario was, of course, somebody called the angry young man. Understand? He was angry because there were no opportunities. He was angry because there were no jobs. He was angry because there were no social development that was happening. He was angry because society was unjust, administration was unjust, there was nothing positive. And Amitabh Bachchan emerged as the poster boy of this movement in a way. He had this movie called Zanjeer. He had another movie called Diwar. In Diwar, he plays this person who is a low-level coolie. And his brother then rises up to become a police officer. And all his life, Amitabh Bachchan had been taunted by the society around him, and it's a very iconic kind of a film. And that was the emergence of the term angry young man in India. But in the 1950s itself, the idea of the angry young man had emerged through the play by John Osborne called Look Back in Anger, where there was this character by the name of Jimmy Porter, who ran a small sweet shop for a woman that he knew, an old woman, and he was leading that kind of an existence. And how, when he marries this woman from an upper class, and the problems of negotiating those relationships, and in the middle of all of this, there is a great deal of political dialogue that is involved. It is an exceptional play. There is one interesting line that says, where Jimmy Porter, actually, the opening of the play itself is quite interesting. It was never done before in the history of British theatre, where when the stage opens, the curtain rises, all you see are, you see a man who's sitting at a table. His face is covered by the newspaper, and his feet are on the table. So the soles of his feet are pointing at the audience. Now, that is supposed to be an ultimate insult. Okay, to show the soles of your feet to somebody. Okay, but that is how the play opened, and people were shocked. But when they watched the play, they realized that this is nothing like they have seen before, and that led to something called the kitchen sink drama. Have you learnt about the kitchen sink drama?
Yes, we have. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, yes. Okay. Mm. The kitchen sink drama, okay, which kind of brought the sordidness of everyday life into the theater. Understand? So those intimate matters, those things that you'd rather keep hidden away from public view, everything was being brought and kept out there. See, that is something symptomatic of the 20th century. Understand? Those angles, those aspects that you never talk about need to be talked about. Okay, so now you understand the political tensions that prevailed in England during the 20th century, and how all of this is reflected in the writing of the time. I mean, where else is it going to be reflected if not in writing, right? So that's the thing. Okay, so these experimentations, 20th century was also the age of literary experimentations. You had James Joyce, who came up with his magnum opus, I would say, Ulysses. You had the works by people like Arnold Bennett. You had the works of H.G. Wells. You had D.H. Lawrence. Whose book, The Sons and Lovers, it was very interesting. It was exceptional in the sense that it showed at very close quarters those discomforts that families experience. But through these characters like Paul Morel and so on, it also lent a window into the psychological processes of the human mind as it lives in this modern age. Okay, so the psychological novel emerged as one of the greatest contributions of the 20th century. And why did the psychological novel emerge in this fashion is because by the time it was the 20th century, the idea of the human mind as something that needs to be explored, something that needs to be examined, understood, and talked about became very prominent. The ideas of psychoanalysis, the ideas of how the mind reacts in the subconscious fashion to the kind of social, political, cultural establishments around us, and how the seeds of these in our mind lead us to influence these external factors. Okay, all of this began to emerge. Okay, and this again was reflected in literature. Okay, yeah. So you had, of course, the place of people like George Bernard Shaw also in the early 20th century, that looked into the social processes, that looked into the political processes from a very, very critical point of view. Understand? So you had themes in Shaw such as the travails of the middle class British society. You had the questions of militarism, education, the place accorded to women in society, all of these things. Yes. So you know uh, then I would like to go on to the First World War. Okay, as you know, it began in on August 1st, 1914, and it went on up to November 1918. Now, it would be absurd to imagine that by the time it was, December 1918, the war came to an end. It is not like that. These wars never end. They are always there in sporadic fashion, here, there, everywhere, and their impact is felt years later as well. Okay, so when the First World War had broken out, many people had extolled it, had talked about its virtues, talked about the greatness of fighting, the glory of fighting for one's motherland, as we have seen in the background to the subaltern. Okay, but as gradually the horrors of the war began to unfold, those voices began to die down, and the voices of those who had suffered directly in the war or had seen these sufferings, experienced these sufferings, began to emerge. You had Siegfried Sassoon, you had Wilfred Owen, you had Robert Graves, people like that who talked about it. Then from 1919, 1919, uh, we see that the young people began to turn away from politics, began to turn away from governance, because it was associated with all that resulted in the First World War. Understand? So there was this gradual disillusionment with mainstream politics. Now, see, link that to what happened with the election of the Labour Party a few years later. See, so history is never an immediate process. It is something that flows down the ages, and the accumulated result is what you see being manifest at some other point in life. Okay, yes. So, as I told you, the First World War officially began in 1914, but there was a literary movement that began before 1914, but became representative of the First World War period. And that is what we call modernism. Okay, modernism. Uh, Now, it was something that demanded a clean break from the literary traditions that went on before it. So, though modernism began before 1914, the events during and after 1914 were so forceful, made such an impact that, modernism then became representative of all that, came a representative of the opposite of all that came before it. Understand? Yes. So we, the elements of modernism, the way that modernist literature carried itself out, those breaks, those literary, let's say, devices that were employed, particularly the stream of consciousness technique. Okay, which kind of showed how the mind travels, the way that thoughts travel. Hmm? All of these things were characteristics of modernist writing at that point of time. Now you had Virginia Woolf, okay, a very prominent writer. You also had her other contemporaries who were part of the Bloomsbury group. Okay. Then you had people like T.S. Eliot who did marvels with his poems. There is this poem called Ash Wednesday in which he talks about the four quartets. It's called the four quartets, where he talks about the aftermath of the war. Where he says the ash on my dress right now used to be a rose. Okay, so he's referring to those aerial bombings that were being carried out by countries on both the sides. Okay, so the rose in my buttonhole, with the ash on my clothes, used to be a rose. Okay, and then he wrote this landmark poem called The Wasteland. I think I have gone on at length about that to you in other classes. Okay, so you have this fragmentary narratives that has peppered most of modernist writing, particularly early modernist writing, where sentences would be left midway. Sometimes there would be these concerted thoughts, and suddenly the author would spot something else and then write about that. Okay, sometimes a sound would suddenly remind them. In James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, the main character Stephen Dedalus is standing and by the side of the river, and then sea. I'm sorry. And then what he does is he glances across. He's wondering about the meaning of art and life and so on. He's trying to find a direction. He wants to know what he stands for. See, that is what this whole point of self discovery is. He wonders what he stands for, and then he sees this young girl, who, lifts her petticoats and wades into the water. This particular scene is called the epiphany of the wading girl. He has these epiphanies is a sudden realization of the truth. Okay, and he realizes that art is what matters. Art is matter and material in this world. Understand? The higher purpose of art, what an artist is, what his role is, what he does in this world, all of these things come to him at that moment of realization. See, such things were never read of in literature before that. Okay, it was always the same old traditions with the cow and the rural life and so on. Because, the Victorian age was desperately trying to hold on. In the 19th century, the Victorian age was desperately trying to hold on to those sets of beliefs, trying to hold on to an old world, which was slowly slipping away from their grasp. Okay, because in the 20th century, 19th and the 20th, like the world was gradually changing, and this change was bewildering everybody around them. So they were trying to desperately hold on to that. But the 20th century had completely detached itself from that, militantly detached itself from those, I would say, nostalgic ideas of a dewy England that existed. Understand? This was a brutal, hard, truncated, fragmentary England, fragmentary Europe that was celebrating that fragmentariness. The tone was somber. There was this sense of lack, lack, that pervaded all these writings. These writings were hungry in terms of negotiating relationships. They were hungry in terms of negotiating their connection with the government, with the people, with society, with culture, with customs. It was a century that was trying to find its voice. Okay, so all of this was represented in modernist literature. And like I told you, techniques such as the stream of consciousness technique. Okay, and this whole emphasis was placed on being elusive, and getting across multiple thoughts within the same structure of the sentence. It was something exceptional. Okay. Ah, and there was no single voice that could be identified with that of the author. Nobody could say this is the author or that is the author, voice of the author. There was no such thing. Polyphony was another feature of modernist fiction. Understand? So this experimentation, the idea of employing multiple voices, polyphony. Okay, polyphony was another technique that modernist literature celebrated. Yes. So you had people like W.B. Yeats who were writing. Okay, so these many selves, like I told you, the psychological aspect, the psychological angle was also explored, and this led to the presence of many voices. Okay, so all in all, it was a rather interesting time. And also architecture was viewed in terms of, or admired in terms of, its contribution, the kind of precision that architecture demanded. Okay, so it was a rather interesting age where people looked for the mind on one hand. At the same time, they also looked for material or matter on the other hand. Understand? And this was also the age where there was the rise of fascism. Okay, you had it in Spain, you had it in Japan was always this way, imperial, but still. Okay, you had it in Germany. Okay, you had it in a number of places. And this began to worry people, because the idea of democracy was something that really, really appealed to them. It was quite precious to them. Yes. So in 1936, um, after the First World War, you had in 1936 the breakout of the Spanish Civil War. Okay, now why I talk about the Spanish Civil War is because many of the writers that you read now, including George Orwell, took part in the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War was a very, very decisive and divisive war in Europe at that point of time, because see, it you had the First World War, and that ended in 1919. When did the Second World War start? Tell me.
1939.
Yes, approximately
1930.
1939. Yes, and you have the Spanish Civil War that comes there in 1936. Understand? So, you had the government that was supported by the USSR. Yes, good. Thank you, Surya. USSR and socialists in other countries, and as well as Western democracies also supported, but not very wholeheartedly. Okay, but you had the dictatorial forces that were supported by, of General Franco, that were supported by countries like Germany and Italy. Okay, so on one hand, ironically, that's the irony of the whole thing. The Spanish loyalists who had an elected government were supported by USSR and the Western democracies. I would have to say again that the Western democracies were not happy about it, but still. So you had one regime, and communist regime, and a set of democracies supporting a certain elected government on one hand. And on the other hand, you had purely dictatorial forces that were supporting a military regime. Understand? So the Spanish Civil War, while it was being fought by the forces of General Franco and the elected loyalist party government, in a way symbolized or foreshadowed the Second World War. You get that? That's the interesting thing. So what was fought in 1936 was in a way reflected again in 1939. Okay, so you had British writers like W.H. Auden, you had Stephen Spender, you had George Orwell, who actively supported the elected Spanish government. And in fact, Orwell had even fought in the war. Okay, and he had gotten injured and he came back and so on. Okay, yeah. So a lot of young writers had participated in the war. Many of them lost their lives and so on. Okay, and they wrote about these things. They saw firsthand the kind of devastation that was being wreaked within Europe through the civil war, and the way that people are actively working to suppress liberty. So liberty became a very important concern. Liberty of a nation, liberty of ideology, liberty of, let's say, people, individual liberty. These things became very, very significant. See, now when you look at it from this point of view, when you view this novel called Animal Farm, you will understand why, Orwell wrote the way he wrote. Okay, because, after the Spanish Civil War, leading on to the Second World War, and the complete breakdown of any form of order, or let's say belief in human systems, what else will a person write? Understand? So like we say, you are what you eat. Similarly, you are what you write. Okay, so anyway, mm, he George Orwell fought in the Spanish Civil War, and when he came back, he wrote a book called Homage to Catalonia. Okay, and his aim was to enlighten or inform the people of his country about the realities that they were closing their eyes to, or that they failed to see, or nobody was telling them about. Understand? He's famously supposed to have said that people of England were sleeping this very deep sleep, out of which they will never wake till they are awoken by the sound of bombs. Okay, and this famously came true in 1939. Okay, because people allowed these fascist forces to grow, and they avoided this direct confrontation for a long time, till it was too late. And they had no choice but to take a stand. Understand? So, this is the point at which I would like to end this particular class, because next class, when we come, we will be talking in brief about Russia, and all the events that led up to the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution, and so on. And then we will move into the novel per se. Okay. So, do you have anything to ask me at this point of time, till this point of time? You have nothing to ask?
Ma'am, ma'am,
Yeah, yeah.
ma'am, can you say about stream of consciousness in this interior monologue?
Oh, you want me to talk about it? Okay.
Yes.
See, like I told you, the stream of consciousness technique kind of travels through time, to and fro in time, within uh, the novel itself. Understand? Instead of following a chronology, okay, like born, then went to have breakfast, then got married, then had children, then died. This is not how we think. Like, even now, when you're sitting in this class, your thoughts would have traveled to 10 different directions, then come back for 1 second and again gone in 10 different directions. Correct? So this is how the human brain works. For example, I'm looking at you, I'm talking to you, I look out of the window, I see a bird flying. It is not just the bird that I see flying. I might make an automatic association with another bird that I might have encountered at another point of time, and I would talk or think about that all the while I'm listening to you. So, what the people of the 20th century, particularly people like James Joyce, thought is, why do we not incorporate that into our books? Okay, into our writing. Why don't we bring that fragmentariness that pervades human thoughts? Why don't we just bring it in here? Understand? And those conversations that one has with oneself, the tussle between ideologies, the tussle between belief systems, the conflict that an individual experiences between what he thinks is right and what he has been told is right. See, all of these compose the interior monologue that we carry out, isn't it? Don't you think so?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, and these things have to be represented in literature, in art, in architecture, everywhere. Understand? So that is what the writers set out to do. People like James Joyce, people like Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence, and so on. Understand? So that is why I'll give you another example. There is this novel called Sound and the Fury. Did I talk to you about Sound and the Fury? William Faulkner?
No, ma'am, I guess no.
No? Oh, okay, fine. It is a beautiful book. Okay, it takes its lines from mm, um, King Lear. Okay, life is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Understand? So that's what King Lear says at one point of time. So Sound and the Fury, and the first part of the novel, first chapter of the novel, it has about 3 chapters. That's it. It's a big book, but it is being told by different people, 3 or 4 chapters actually. It's being told by different people from different people's point of view. Okay, so I am a character, you are a character, Lakshmi Priya is a character, Anna Thomas is a character. So the first chapter is my story, the same story from my point of view. The second from your point of view. Third from Anna's point of view. It goes like that. Okay, so the first chapter you don't understand anything. It is just a caddy smelled like trees. This was happening, that was happening. Okay, then Hirsch came, they came, Versh, it's just like that, and you wonder what is happening. And then you realize that this is being told by a character called Benjamin Benji, who is developmentally challenged. Understand? Now, life is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. The novel's title itself is Sound and the Fury. Understand? And then what doesn't make sense in the first chapter, I'm telling you, you have to read the book, you have to outlive the first chapter and go to the second chapters, after which you won't be able to put it down. Okay, you go on to other chapters which are being told by other people, and in that there is this eldest brother. It's a story of siblings. The eldest brother is there called Quentin Compson. And Quentin Compson one day is lying in his room, and the clock strikes 12. Now it's a kind of clock that will strike 12, and by that it will do it 12 times. So he's lying there, and when the clock strikes, first, then he thinks about a time when he had gone out for a walk, and he travels through all kinds of places, meets a young girl. He's living this entire afternoon that he had spent one time within the 12 strikes of the clock. Okay, he remembers meeting this young kid, and he buys her a loaf of bread because she's very hungry. She takes that loaf, she goes running down the streets, and then what happened, all of that. You can feel the heat of the afternoon, you can feel this young man's confusion, you can feel the kind of kindness that he wants to show this kid. All of that is there. And by the time the clock finishes striking 12, he does something. Okay, I'm hoping that one day you will meet this book and you will decide to read it. So I'm not going to spoil it for you. Okay, so that's all. And now see, in the time that it took me to narrate a portion of this story, how many thoughts would have gone on through your mind? You would have, if you were listening to me, you would have imagined a man, or you would put somebody whom you know in this place. See the way that your thoughts will go. Understand? And those weird confusions that run in our minds at various times. Is this right? But that is what I have been told to do, but this is what I want to do. Which of this is right? Which of this is true? Which of this is good? The whole battle of good and not good. Is there something called evil? All of these are philosophical concerns that should be troubling you at this point of time, if you have a modicum of common sense. Understand? Which I hope you have. Yeah, all of these things are what compose your internal monologue, your interior monologue. Understand? So the workings of the mind, the workings of the heart, the complex relationships that exist between people, those strange intimate desires that we'd rather not talk about, that we keep suppressed within our hearts and minds. It manifests itself in our actions, in the unconscious. Sometimes it might be irrational anger towards some human being, maybe because we really love them, but we are not in a position to articulate it. Maybe because we really hate them, because we actually love them and we are not able to articulate it. Maybe because we actually hate them because they deserve it. Okay? But you can't really say it because people are going to be like, what is your problem? Those kind of things. So, in the 20th century, the novel began to describe, write, discuss these things. That clear your doubt, Abhija?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. Anything
That's
else?
all. No, that's all.
Okay. Anybody else? Anything else? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording at this point.